You're live. I'm going to read modules 7, 8, and 9, starting with 7, breach. When does a breach occur? If it is found that 1, the promisor is under an absolute duty to perform, and 2, this absolute duty to perform has not been discharged, then this failure to perform in accordance with contractual terms will amount to a breach of the contract. The non-breaching party who sues a breach of contract The non-breaching party who sues for breach of contract must show that they are willing and able to perform, but for the breaching party's failure to perform. Material or minor breach, common law contracts. Once you have determined that there is a breach of contract, the next steps in a common law contract situation is to determine whether the breach is material or minor. Determining materiality of breach. In determining whether a breach is material or minor, courts look at A, the amount of benefit received by the non-breaching party, B, the adequacy of compensation for damages to the injured party, C, the extent of part performance by the breaching party, D, hardship to the breaching party, E, negligent or willful behavior of the breaching party, and F, the likelihood that the breaching party will perform the remainder of the contract. So that's how you determine the materiality of the breach. I'm just going to read it again. Amount of benefit received by non-breaching party, adequacy of compensation for damages to the injured party, the extent of part performance by the breaching party, hardship to the breaching party, negligent or willful behavior of the breaching party, and the likelihood that the breaching party will perform the remainder of the contract. Effect of breaches. A breach of contract is minor if the obligee gains the substantial benefit of their bargain despite the obligor's defective performance. A minor breach does not relieve the aggrieved party of their duty of performance under the contract. It merely gives them a right to damages set off for the minor breach. Material breach. If the obligee does not receive the substantial benefit of their bargain, the breach is considered material. If the breach is material, the non-breaching party 1 may treat the contract as at an end, that is, any duty of counter-performance owed by them will be discharged, and 2 will have an immediate right to all remedies for breach of the entire contract, including total damages. So those are the definitions of minor breach and material breach. Minor breach. A breach of contract is minor if the obligee gains the substantial benefit of their bargain despite the obligor's effective performance. A minor breach does not relieve the aggrieved party of their duty of performance under the contract. It merely gives them a right to damages or set off for the minor breach. Whereas the definition of material breach, if the obligee does not receive the substantial benefit of their bargain, the breach is considered material. If the breach is material, the non-breaching party 1 may treat the contract as at an end, that is, any duty of counter-performance owed by them will be discharged, and 2 will have an immediate right to all remedies for breach of the entire contract, including total damages. C, minor breach coupled with anticipatory repudiation. If a minor breach coupled with anticipatory repudiation is coupled with AR, the non-breaching party may treat it as a material breach, that is, they may sue immediately for total damages and are permanently discharged from any duty of further performance. Indeed, the courts hold that the aggrieved party must not continue on because to do so would be a failure to mitigate damages. The UCC modifies this to permit a party to complete the manufacture of goods to avoid having to sell unfinished goods at a lower salvage value. D, material breach of divisible contract. In a divisible contract, recovery is available for substantial performance of a divisible part, even though there has been a material breach of the entire contract. Timeliness of performance. Failure to perform by the time stated in the contract is generally not a material breach if performance is rendered within a reasonable time. However, if the nature of the contract makes timely performance essential, or if the contract expressly provides that time is of the essence, then failure to perform on time is usually a material breach. Merely including a date for performance does not make time of the essence. Note that while traditionally any delay in performance of contract with a time of the essence provision was a material breach, modern courts look at all of the circumstances to determine whether performance on the specified date was vitally important and whether parties truly intended it to be so. Section 7.3 Perfect Tender Rule for the Sale of Goods. Article 2 generally doesn't follow the common law substantial performance doctrine. Instead, it follows the perfect tender rule. If goods or their delivery fail to conform to the contract in any way, the buyer generally may reject all, accept all, or accept any commercial units and reject the rest. 7.3.1 Right to reject cut off by acceptance. A buyer's right to reject under the perfect tender doctrine generally is cut off by acceptance. Under Article 2, a buyer accepts when, after a reasonable opportunity to inspect the goods, they indicate to the seller that the goods conform to requirements or that they will keep the goods even though they fail to conform. They fail to reject within a reasonable time after tender or delivery of the goods, or fail to seasonably notify the seller of their rejection, or C, they do any act inconsistent with the seller's ownership. So the right to reject cut off by acceptance. A buyer accepts when, after a reasonable opportunity to inspect the goods, they indicate to the seller that the goods conform to the requirements, so they will keep the goods even though they fail to conform. Or B, they fail to reject within a reasonable time after tender or delivery of goods, or fail to seasonably notify the seller of the rejection. Or C, they do any act inconsistent with seller's ownership. Buyer responsibility for goods after rejection. After rejecting goods in their physical possession, the buyer must treat the goods as if they own them. The buyer has an obligation to hold the goods with reasonable care at the seller's disposition for a time sufficient to permit the seller to remove them. If the seller has no agent or place of business within the market area where the goods are rejected, a merchant buyer has a further obligation to obey any reasonable instructions as to the rejected goods. For example, arrange to reship the goods. If the seller receives or gives no instructions within a reasonable time, the buyer may 1. Reship the goods to the seller, 2. Store them for the seller's account, or 3. Resell them for the seller's account in a public sale or a private sale after giving the seller reasonable notice of intent to resell. If the buyer properly resells the rejected goods, they are entitled to recover their expenses and a reasonable commission. If the buyer wrongfully exercises ownership over the rejected goods, the seller has an action against the buyer for conversion. Buyer's right to revoke acceptance. Once goods are accepted, the buyer's power to reject the goods generally is terminated, and the buyer is obligated to pay the price less any damages resulting from the seller's breach. However, under limited situations, the buyer may revoke an acceptance already made. A proper revocation of acceptance has the effect of a rejection. When acceptance may be revoked, a buyer may revoke their acceptance if the goods have a defect that substantially impairs their value to the buyer and they accepted the goods on the reasonable belief that the defect would be cured and it has not been, or they accepted the goods because of the difficulty of discovering the defects or because of the seller's assurance that the goods conform to the contract. Revocation of acceptance must occur 1. Within a reasonable time after the buyer discovers or should have discovered the defects, and 2. Before any substantial change in the goods occurs that is not caused by a defect present at the time the seller relinquished possession. exceptions to the perfect tender rule. A, seller's right to cure in single delivery contracts is going to proceed first. We're on page 113. We will then go to installment contracts. In single delivery contracts, a seller can cure by notice and new tender within time for performance. If the buyer has rejected goods because of defects, the seller may, within the time originally provided for performance, cure by giving reasonable notice of their intention to do so and making a new tender of conforming goods that the buyer must then accept. Seller's right to cure beyond original contract time. Ordinarily, the seller has no right to cure beyond the original contract time. However, if the buyer rejects a tender of non-conforming goods that the seller reasonably believed would be acceptable, with or without money allowance, the seller, upon a reasonable notification to the buyer, has a further reasonable time beyond the original contract time within which to make a conforming tender. A seller will probably be found to have had reasonable cause to believe that the tender would be acceptable if the seller can show that 1, trade practices or prior dealings with the buyer led the seller to believe that the goods would be acceptable, or 2, the seller could not have known of the defect despite proper business conduct, for example, packaged goods purchased from a supplier. There's a table on page 114. It's two-part. The first part is the buyer places an order with the seller for 100 red widgets at $3 per widget. And in this decision tree, you ask, did the seller promise to ship the widgets? If yes, there is a contract. Buyer's offer was accepted. If no, there is no contract, just an offer from the buyer. Now, in part 2 of the non-conforming goods table, the inquiry is, seller ships 90 red widgets and 10 blue widgets to buyer. This is a breach of contract under the perfect tender rule unless seller cures in time. And ergo, the buyer may accept all, reject all, or accept any number of widgets and reject the rest. Buyer is also entitled to damages. On the other hand, the alternate inquiry under this fact set would be, did seller provide notice that the non-conforming goods were shipped as an accommodation? If yes, the shipment is a counteroffer which buyer may accept or reject. If they accept all, there's a contract for 90 red and 10 blue widgets. If they reject all, there's no contract. Now, going back to the inquiry, did the seller provide notice that the non-conforming goods were shipped as an accommodation? If no, the shipment is both acceptance of buyer's offer and breach of the resulting contract. And that leads to the same conclusion as if it was just a breach of contract initially, which arises under the perfect tender rule, and the buyer may accept all, reject all, or accept any number of widgets and reject the rest. Buyer is also entitled to damages. So moving on to page 115, installment contracts, and I think we're in seller's right. No, yeah, we were under seller's right to cure as an exception to the perfect tender rule, but now we're actually, we still are as it relates to installment contracts. The right to reject when a contract is an installment contract, that is, when there is to be more than one delivery, is much more limited than in a single delivery contract situation. Installment contracts follow a rule akin to the common law substantial performance doctrine. In an installment contract situation, an installment can be rejected only if the nonconformity substantially impairs the value of the installment and cannot be cured. In addition, the whole contract is breached only if the nonconformity substantially impairs the value of the entire contract. Now we're moving to section 7.4, anticipatory repudiation. Recall that an anticipatory repudiation can be treated as an immediate breach of contract. Finally, breach of warranty. Sellers give warranties as to the condition of goods that apply even after acceptance. Failure to live up to these warranties constitutes a breach of warranty for which a remedy is available. Now I've gotten to Module 8. I kind of need a break, but I'm going to read through this. It's about remedies. Starting with non-monetary remedies. There are two broad branches of remedies available in breach of contract situations, non-monetary and monetary. The primary non-monetary remedy for exam purposes is specific performance, but Article 2 has a number of other specific non-monetary remedies for certain situations involving contracts for the sale of goods. So I did not read that paragraph. There are two broad ranges of remedies available in breach of contract situations. They're non-monetary and monetary. The primary non-monetary remedy for exam purposes is specific performance. Article 2 has a number of other specific non-monetary remedies for certain situations involving contracts for the sale of goods. Specific performance. If the legal remedy, that is money damages, is inadequate, the non-breaching party may seek specific performance, which is an order from the court to the breaching party to perform or face contempt of court charges. Which is an order from the court to the breaching party to perform or face contempt of court charges. Available for land and rare or unique goods. Specific performance is always available for land sale contracts because all land is unique. It is also available for goods that are rare or unique at the time of performance is due. For example, rare paintings, gasoline in short supply because of embargoes, etc., is not available for breach of contract to provide services. This is just kind of another thought. All land is unique. It's also available for unique goods. However, not as it relates to the provision of services, even if services are rare or unique. This is because of the problems of enforcement. It would be difficult for the court to supervise the performance, and because the courts feel it is tantamount to involuntary servitude, which is prohibited by the Constitution. Injunction as alternate remedy. In contrast, a court may enjoin a breaching party from working for a competitor throughout the duration of the contract if the services contracted for are rare or unique. Covenant not to compete. Most courts will grant an order of specific performance to enforce a contract not to compete if 1. The services to be performed are unique, thus rendering money damages inadequate, and 2. The covenant is reasonable to be reasonable. A covenant must be reasonably necessary to protect a legitimate interest in the person benefited by the covenant, that is, an employer or the purchaser of the covenantor's business. A covenant must be reasonable as to its geographic scope and duration, meaning it cannot be broader than the benefited person's customer base and typically cannot be longer than 1 or 2 years, and the covenant must not harm the public. So those are under the covenant not to compete. Equitable defenses available. In addition to standard contract defenses, an action for a specific performance is subject to the equitable defenses of laches, unclean hands. That's all that's on this page. There'll be more, but laches is a claim that the plaintiffs have delayed bringing the action and the delay has prejudiced the defendant. Unclean hands, a claim that the party seeking specific performance is guilty of wrongdoing in the transaction being sued upon. And let's read on. Okay, there's only one more in this section called sale to a bona fide purchaser, a claim that the subject matter has been sold to a person who purchased for value and in good faith. Non-monetary remedies under Article 2. Buyer's non-monetary remedies include cancellation if a buyer rightfully rejects goods because they do not conform to the contract. One of her opponents is simply to cancel the contract. So cute. Next is buyer's right to replevy identified goods. We're also going to enter buyer's right to specific performance before going to the seller's non-monetary remedies, which is the seller's right to withhold goods and the seller's right to recover goods. Before we start going to buyer's insolvency and buyer's insolvency and buyer's breach is actually part of this section. There'll be one last one titled seller's ability to force goods on buyer limited, and right to demand assurances is a little bit of a different section within the non-monetary remedies under Article 2 titles. So I just start cancellation. If a buyer rejects goods because they do not conform to the contract, one of her options is simply to cancel the contract. So the buyer's right to replevy identified goods on buyer's prepayment. If a buyer has made at least part payment of the purchase price of goods that have been identified under a contract and the seller has not delivered the goods, the buyer may replevy the goods from the seller in two circumstances. The seller becomes insolvent within 10 days after receiving the buyer's first payment, or the goods were purchased for personal, family, or household purposes. In either case, the buyer must tender any unpaid portion of the purchase price to the seller. Do you want to sit here? Where I am? So you can pet him? Okay, let's just moving. Alright.
Can I help you with that stuff?
Oh. You see Philly with you. Where was I?
You stupid dog.
I was talking about the seller becomes insolvent within 10 days after receiving the buyer's first payment, or the goods were purchased for personal, family, and household purposes. In either case, the buyer must tender any unpaid portion of the purchase price to the seller. You can't put your water there. He won't go in there if the water's there. He's looking the other way, like he acting like he was. Yeah, he was act. He was putting up an act. Like you don't see him there.
Let's just go for it.
Alright, he's noticed you. You just pretend like you're not paying, like you don't need him to come over because he will.
You speed it up.
I'm gonna keep on going so I can be done. On buyer's inability to cover, in addition, the buyer may replevy undelivered, unidentified goods from the seller. If the buyer, after reasonable effort, is unable to secure adequate substitute goods, that is, cover buyer's right to specific performance. A right closely related to the buyer's right to replevy is the right to specific performance, where the goods are unique or in other proper circumstances, the goods may order specific performance even where the goods have not yet been identified to the contract by the seller. Seller's non-monetary remedies. So that was tough getting through buyer's non-monetary remedies. But we're now into seller's non-monetary remedies. So again, buyer's non-monetary remedies for cancellation, right to replevy identified goods. In three circumstances. And those circumstances when they could replevy is when the buyer's prepaid, the buyer's unable to cover, and the buyer's right to specific performance. Seller's non-monetary remedy. That's what he spent most of the night, actually. I think some of it. The seller's right to withhold goods. If the buyer fails to make a payment due on or before delivery, the seller may withhold delivery of the goods. The seller may also withhold goods when the goods are sold on credit and before the goods are delivered, the seller discovers that the buyer is insolvent. However, in such a case, the seller must deliver the goods if the buyer tenders cash for their payment. Seller's right to recover goods. Seller right to recover from buyer on buyer's insolvency. If the seller learns that the buyer had received delivery of goods on credit while insolvent, the seller may reclaim the goods upon demand made within 10 days after the buyer's receipt of the goods. However, the 10-day limitation does not apply if the misrepresentation of solvency has been made in writing to the particular seller within 3 months before delivery. So that's your seller's right to recover the goods. On buyer's insolvency, if the buyers receive delivery of the goods on credit while insolvent, the seller may reclaim the goods upon demand made within 10 days after the buyer's receipt of the goods. However, the 10-day limitation does not apply if misrepresentation of solvency has been made in writing, in which case 3 months is the new limitation. Right within the seller's right to recover goods, there is also the right to recover shipped or stored goods from bailee. On buyer's insolvency, the seller may stop delivery of goods in the possession of a carrier or other bailee if they discover that the buyer is insolvent. Of course, the seller must deliver the goods if the buyer tenders cash for their payment. On buyer's breach, the seller may stop delivery of a carload, truckload, plane load, or large shipments of goods if the buyer breaches the contract or the seller has a right to withhold performance pending receipt of assurances. See infra the right to demand assurances, which is coming up. After this last bullet, seller's ability to force goods on buyer limited. The seller's ability to force goods on a buyer is limited to an action for price when the seller is unable to resell the goods to others at a reasonable price. C, right to demand assurances. Actions or circumstances that increase the risk of non-performance by a party to a contract but not clearly indicate that performance will not be forthcoming may not be treated immediately as an anticipatory repudiation. Instead, if there are reasonable grounds for insecurity with respect to a party's performance, the other party may demand in writing assurances that the performance will be forthcoming at the proper time until they receive performance. Oh boy. Gosh, you're still there. Oh my god.
It's got another dirty butt.
Where is I? These grounds for insecurity with respect to the party's performance, the other party may demand in writing assurances that the performance will be forthcoming at the proper time. Until they receive adequate assurances, the party may suspend their own performance. If the proper assurances are not given within the reasonable time, that is, within 30 days after a justified demand for assurances, then they may treat the contract as repudiated. What constitutes an adequate assurance depends on the facts of the case. And so what they've highlighted in this exam tips section is the right to demand assurances arises when there's reasonable grounds for insecurity. Something makes the party nervous that the other will not perform. Anticipatory repudiation requires much more than nervousness. There must be a clear indication that the other party is unwilling or unable to perform. Thus, for example, I am not going to perform is an anticipatory repudiation, but I am not sure that I can perform is different. Now we're in monetary remedy damages. Damages can be recovered only to the extent that they have proved with reasonable certainty that they could not have been avoided with reasonable effort. Types of damages. Compensatory damages. The usual goal of damages for a breach of contract is put the non-breaching party in a position they would have been in had the promise been performed. As far as money can do this. Standard measure of damages. Expectation damages. In most cases, the plaintiff's standard measure of damages will be based on the expectation measure, that is, sufficient damages for them to buy a substitute performance. This is known as the benefit of the bargain damages. I wanted him to show you that for a while. What'd you do? Get it again. Oh. Come on. You want to do it? No?
It's going to come out your left side again.
Boy.
Guarantee it.
He's coming out, I'm sure. Where was I? Compensatory damages. As much as money can put the non-breaching party in position as if the breaching party would have performed. Standard measure of damages, expectation damages. In most cases, the plaintiff's standard measure of damages will be based on the expectation measure. That is, sufficient damages for them to buy a substitute performance. This is known as the benefit of the bargain damages. Reliance damage measure. If the plaintiff's expectation damages are too speculative to measure, for example, the plaintiff cannot show with sufficient certainty that the profits they would have made if the defendant had performed the contract, the plaintiff may elect to recover those damages they have suffered based on reasonable reliance on the contract. Reliance damages award the plaintiff the cost of their performance, that is, they are designed to put the plaintiff in a position that would have been in had the contract never been performed. And now we're getting to incidental, consequential, punitive, nominal, liquidated damages. Just checking how much more there will be in this section before getting to the next module. It's looking like 6 pages already, at least. So let's move through these incidentals. Compensatory damages may also include incidental damages. Incidental damages are most commonly associated with contracts for the sale of goods and typically include expenses reasonably incurred by a buyer in inspection, receipt, transportation, care, and custody of goods rightfully rejected, and other expenses reasonably incident to the seller's breach, and by the seller in storing, shipping, returning, and reselling the goods as a result of the buyer's breach. Consequential damages. Consequential damages are special damages that reflect losses over and above standard expectation damages. They arise because of the non-breaching party's particular circumstances, and most often they consist of lost profits. These damages may be recovered only if, at the time the contract was made, a reasonable person would have foreseen the damages as the probable result of a breach. Foreseeability is a key issue for consequential damages. To recover consequential damages, a breaching party must have known or had reason to know the special circumstances giving rise to the damages. Note that in contracts for the sale of goods, only a buyer may recover consequential damages. Certainty rule. The plaintiff must prove that the losses suffered were certain in their nature and not speculative. Traditionally, if the breaching party prevented the non-breaching party from setting up a new business, courts will not award lost profits from the prospective business as damages because they were too speculative. However, modern courts may allow lost profits as damages if they can be made more certain by observing similar businesses in the area or other businesses previously owned by the same party. Punitive damages. Punitive damages are generally not awarded in contract cases. Nominal damages. Nominal token damages, for example, $1, may be awarded when a breach is shown but no actual loss is proven. Liquidated damages. The parties to a contract may stipulate what damages are to be paid in the event of a breach. These liquidated damages must be an amount that is reasonable in view of the actual or anticipated harm caused by the breach. Requirements for enforcement. Liquidated damage clauses will be enforceable if the following 2 requirements are met. Damages for a contractual breach are difficult to estimate or ascertain at the time the contract is formed. and the amount agreed on is a reasonable forecast of compensatory damages in the case of breach. The test for reasonableness is a comparison between the amount of damages prospectively probable at the time of the contract formation and the liquidated damages figure. If the liquidated damages amount is unreasonable, the courts will construe this as a penalty and will not enforce the provision. Revocable even if no actual damages. If the above requirements are met, the plaintiff will receive the liquidated damages amount. Most courts hold this is so even if no actual or pecuniary damages have been suffered. Contracts for sale of goods. Buyer damages. Seller does not deliver or buyer rejects and revokes. If the seller doesn't deliver or the buyer properly rejects the goods or revokes acceptance of the goods, the buyer's basic damages consist of the difference between the contract price and either the market price or the cost of buying replacement goods, which is called cover, plus incidental and consequential damages, if any, less expenses saved as a result of the seller's breach. Difference between contract price and cost of replacement goods, i.e. cover. If the buyer chooses the cover measure, the difference between contract price and cost of buying replacement goods, the buyer must make a reasonable contract for substitute goods in good faith and without unreasonable delay. Difference between contract price and market price. If the buyer measures damages by the difference between contract price and market price, the market price usually is determined as of the time the buyer learns of the breach and at the place of tender. Seller delivers non-conforming goods, the buyer accepts. Warranty damages. If the buyer accepts goods that breach one of the seller's warranties, the buyer may recover as damages loss resulting in the normal course of events from the breach. The basic measure of damages in such a case is the difference between the value of goods as delivered and the value they would have if they had been according to the contract, plus incidental and consequential damages. Notice requirement. To recover damages for any defect as to accepted goods, the buyer must, within a reasonable time after they discover it, should have discovered the defect, notify the seller of the defect. If they do not notify the seller within a reasonable time, they lose their right to sue. Reasonable time is, of course, a flexible standard. Seller anticipatorily breaches contract. The measure of damages when the seller anticipatorily breaches the contract is the difference between the market price at the time the buyer learned of the breach and the contract price. Consequential damages. As noted above, the seller is liable for consequential damages arising from their breach if they had reason to know the buyer's general or particular requirements, and 2, the subsequent loss resulting from those needs could not reasonably be prevented by cover. Particular needs must be made known to the seller, but general requirements usually need not be. Goods for resale. If the buyer is in the business of reselling the goods, the seller is deemed to have knowledge of the resale. Goods necessary for manufacturing. If a seller knows that the goods they provide are to be used in the manufacturing process, they should know that their breach would cause a disruption in production leading to a loss of profits. That's a new one. The seller knows that the goods they provide are to be used in the manufacturing process. They should know that their breach will cause a disruption in production, leading to a loss of profits. So the next part of this is seller damages, probably under a sale of goods contract, where the buyer repudiates or refuses to accept non-conforming goods. The code provides 3 measures for damages when the buyer wrongfully repudiates or refuses to accept conforming goods. In addition to incidental damages, for example, cost of storing, shipping, reselling, the seller can resell the goods and recover the price between the contract price and the resale price. Recover the difference, this is B, recover the difference between the market price measured as of the time and at the place of delivery and the contract price, or 3rd, the above measures are inadequate because the seller could have made an additional sale, then seller may recover under a lost profits measure the difference between the contract price and the cost of the seller, which is their profit. Next page. Next page is a bunch of hypos plus where the buyer accepted goods, action for price. If the buyer has accepted the goods and has not paid or has not accepted the goods and the seller is unable to resell them at any reasonable price, or if the goods have been lost or damaged at a time and the risk of loss was on the buyer, the seller may maintain an action against the buyer for the full contract price. Article 2 damage measures for total breach. Buyer does not accept or seller does not deliver. All right. Buyer's measures. Benefit of bargain, which is the market price minus the contract price, or cover. Cost of reasonable replacement goods minus the contract price. And then what would be in addition to that, would be adding in incidental damages and foreseeable consequential damages minus the expenses saved. For the seller measures, there's 4 year. For alternatives, where incidental is added and expenses saved is subtracted from it. So first there's the benefit of the bargain, the contract sale minus the market price. And there's the resale, which is the contract price minus the resale price. There's the lost profit, which is the contract price minus the cost of goods. And there's an action for price, which is the contract price. So those are the 4 seller measures. Hopefully we got to nowhere near Module 9 yet. You have contracts for sale of land, employment contracts, construction contracts, contracts calling for installment payments, avoidable damages. These are all section titles. Goodness. Plus employment contracts, manufacturing contracts, construction contracts, contracts for sale of goods before getting to restitution. So I'm just going to take a little break here. Rather than continue.